What's up, everybody? It's me, Nick, and today we're doing an LA voter guide edition. For those of you that don't know, I've lived in LA for about 6 years now, and I've been working on political campaigns ever since I moved here. Managed a campaign for state senate, managed a campaign for county supervisor, and every couple years when elections roll around, people are asking me about my opinion on all the various ballot measures and candidates that fill up this mighty ballot we have here. So I thought that this time I would do just a little video going through this, which is going to be your best friend throughout this whole process and every election you do in your whole life. Hopefully, get some evergreen content out of that bit and then go through the specific things that are on the ballot this year. Only 2 weeks until election day. I hate the idea that, only the 7 battleground states matter because the presidential election just dominates the news cycle right now. The fact is that there are a ton of things on your ballot, no matter where you live, that are incredibly important. And the more local the issue is, the more important and the more directly it's going to influence you. So, for those of you that live in Los Angeles and California, hopefully you find some usefulness out of this. And especially this first part that has to do with this bad boy right here, the official voter guide. I hope that this is something that you can refer to and use to do your voting. All right. Moving on. All right, so like I said, we are going to start with this thing right here, the official voter guide. This comes to every household that is registered to vote. You can register to vote up until election day in the state of California. You can show up to the polling place without having registered and register to vote. But ideally, you'll have registered more than a month in advance because then you will be sent a ballot in the mail. If you get sent a ballot in the mail, you will also get one of these. So, how does this thing help you decide how to vote? Actually, real quick, before we get to this thing, I want to go over very quickly what the California initiative and referendum system is. Now, this goes back over 100 years. It is what we in California have as our version of direct democracy. An initiative is when the voters propose either a state law or an amendment to the Constitution. It can be on any topic as long as it is constitutional under the US Constitution. So you can't do anything. I'm not even going to give an example. You can't do anything unconstitutional. That's the only limit. That is the initiative process. You get a bunch of people to sign a petition. You submit a 75-word title and summary to the Attorney General's office. They tweak it a little bit. They put it on the ballot if you qualify. And if the people vote for it, it is now law in the land of California. The referendum process is a little bit different. It's very similar to the initiative process in that it is the voters voting on a piece of legislation. The difference is it is something the legislature has already passed. Why is that different? Now, a referendum is sort of like an initiative. The difference is that the legislature has already passed a law, but a group of voters has decided to challenge that law, or it is something that changes the California state constitution or it raises new taxes. Any of those things need to go to the voters ultimately to be approved or rejected. So, how does an initiative work, you might be wondering? All you have to do is you have an idea for a law. Okay. Maybe your legislator decide they weren't interested in it. Maybe you think that it's too controversial and politicians won't touch it. Or maybe you just have a lot of money and you've got a pet issue and you want to force it onto the ballot. That tends to be how the initiative system gets used these days. More on that later. But essentially, all you have to do is get enough people. It's about low 6 figures number of voters. It's a certain percentage of the number of people who voted in the last election for governor. If you get that number of people to sign a petition for your initiative and you've submitted a title and summary to the Attorney General, that is what the label on the law is going to be, and then describing what the effect of the law is. That is what the voters are going to see ultimately. Now, there's also some technical legal writing that goes into the actual implementation, but for the purposes of this video, that's what you need to worry about. Now, that 75-word summary is supposed to be true and impartial. That's the language of the law. But it is ultimately written by an elected official, the state attorney general. That's led to a lot of controversy over the years because the way that you frame a particular ballot measure can really influence the way that voters see that issue. For example, there was a lot of debate a few years ago over repealing or the possibility of repealing part of California's state gas tax, specifically the most recent increase. And instead of framing it as a vote to repeal the gas tax, the attorney general published it in the voter guide initially as a measure to eliminate road funding because gas tax funds are ultimately used to pay for things like road construction and maintenance. Now, that's not objectively false. By the letter of the law, they argued that it was correct, but it was clearly done with an intent to influence the way that voters saw the issue. And that's where this process can get really tricky. And that's why we always see a lot of litigation go into what those specific words are that appear on the ballot. Now, for the most part, because there's so much litigation that goes into it, because there are legal protections that say that the summary needs to be objective and true, I'm going to tell you here, especially if you don't have time to do exhaustive research into all these issues, the title, much like a headline with an article, you should take with a grain of salt. The summary for each ballot measure that we see is going to be the thing that you can hang your hat on the most and the thing that you can take the most at face value. This raises as good a time as any to actually jump into the voter guide. So, like I said at the beginning, this is the thing that you're going to get in the mail about a month before each election. The first thing that you're going to see in this voter guide is the quick reference guide. This has every ballot measure listed out one by one. It also has the registered supporters, the registered opponents, the projected fiscal impact. That's how much it's going to cost, whether for the state or for your local government. And then it also has arguments for or against, as well as statements about what a yes or a no vote would do. Again, the summary is the part that's written by the Attorney General's office and is required by law to be impartial, true, and fair. Okay. The yes or no vote, what those mean, the arguments pro and con, what those mean, those are written by the supporters and opponents that you see up at the top of each ballot item. So there's going to be much more detailed descriptions as we get into each ballot measure, but you can just look at this quick reference guide and get a pretty good sense of what all of these different ballot measures do. I would not recommend just doing that as your research, but if you've only got 20 minutes, you weren't planning on voting anyway, and this is the only way that you're going to do it. I am personally one of those people that would rather have you vote than not vote. This is all you need if you're just trying to vote in the most painless way possible. I would hope that you take the time to go through some of the other steps of analysis I'm going to outline here, but that's as good a start as any. Next, we're on to what each individual ballot looks like, what each individual measure looks like. Okay. So this top thing here, that's the official title that was submitted by whoever organized the initiative. Here's the summary written by the Attorney General's office, although it is informed by the person that submitted the initiative. Then you have this report from the legislative analyst. This part is really good. The legislative analyst is, I would say, the equivalent at the federal level would be either the Congressional Budget Office or the Congressional Research Service, probably the Congressional Budget Office. But this is the person that is paid by the legislature to be a nonpartisan guide to the actual impact of a given piece of legislation. How much is it going to cost the state? How are we going to pay for it? How is it being divided between levels of government? That's what the legislative analyst is going to tell you. They're not going to get into the merits of a particular issue. That's not their job. Their job is, and I was about to say just, but it's a huge deal, is analyzing how the money, how much this is actually going to cost and whether it's going to be covered by existing revenue or whether funds will need to be raised through taxes in order to pay for it. Okay. The legislative analyst's position is going to be especially important when it comes to things like bond measures. What is a bond? I'm sure you're asking yourself. Very briefly, the government in California, because we don't have the ability to run huge deficits like the federal government, we can't print money, right? So the way that California and other local governments generally spend money is one of two ways. One, you raise taxes and you spend money through what's called the general fund directly. General fund is the big pot of money that our taxes go into that the legislature then decides how to spend every year through the budget. The other way that the government can raise money, ultimately it's still going to be paid through taxes, but what the government can do instead of spending it with tax revenue that it has right now is it can borrow the money that it wants to spend on a particular project, and then it repays that loan over time with interest. And it only makes those interest payments each year rather than the full cost or the full face value of the bond, right? So this is something that, California has about a $300 billion budget each year, give or take a little bit. We have a relatively volatile budget. That means it goes up and down a lot because we rely heavily on capital gains taxes and taxation of the top 1% whose finances tend to fluctuate more than the general population. General fund is how government pays for stuff most of the time. But if the government either doesn't want to prioritize a particular item or it's a lot of money to spend right now and we'd rather spend a little bit each year on it and pay it back over time, that's when the government will borrow the money and then pay it back with interest over time through a bond. Bonds have to be approved by the voters. The reason for that is because the cost of the actual project will cost more than if they had just paid for it up front through the taxes that already exist. I mean, I guess that's the reason, but the real reason is just that it's in the state constitution that voters have to approve general obligation bonds. Getting back to this thing, we had our title, we had our summary, we had our legislative analyst report. Over here, you can see how the legislator voted on it. The only reason to really look at this, just so you understand, because we are a one-party state at this point. We have a supermajority in both chambers. The only reason that I ever look at how the Assembly and the Senate voted on something and to see if there's any kind of controversy over the measure, whether that's because a large section of the legislature just didn't vote on it because that it was especially a hot button issue, or if there's just a lot of no votes compared to I votes. That's also really interesting to me. That if I see that, I usually will take an extra long look at it. Last, just like the last part of the quick reference guide, under each ballot item, you're going to have the arguments for, rebuttals to the arguments for, the arguments against, and then rebuttal to the arguments against, just like debate class back in high school. For each of those for and against arguments, always be looking back at that initial title and summary that says who the organized support and opposition are, because that will usually help you to understand where their arguments are coming from, what their vested interest is in a particular outcome. You should always be keeping that at the front of your mind, even if you think that, based on a particular measure, of course I support that. In my experience, you always want to be paying attention to who is behind a given ballot measure, who stands to gain from it, who stands to lose from it. Why is somebody so intent on advancing a particular position on a piece of legislation? Is it because, in the case of, let's say, rent control legislation, are the people that are supporting or that are opposed to rent control, are they people that are experts in housing policy, or are they people that own a lot of apartment property? Are they people that have a vested interest in the real estate industry? Not naming any names, not talking about any measure in particular here, but just one example, because housing policy is something that's very controversial here in California. We need a lot more housing. How we do it is where we always disagree. I like to say the devil's in the details. One of my old bosses likes to say God is in the details. In this case, God is in the details. You need to find out who is behind those arguments for and against so you can better understand if you really agree with it or whether you may need to take a second look because somebody might have a financial interest in the argument they're making. Maybe it's not about what's in the public interest. last and certainly not least, if you live in the city of Los Angeles, or if you live in any of the major big cities here in California, on top of the state voter guide that comes from the Secretary of State, you will also get from your local city clerk your city voter guide that will have any city charter amendments or any local ordinances or tax measures that need to be voted on by the local populace. I will cover this at the very end of the next video. At this point, this video is getting pretty long, so I'm just going to keep this as my voter guide episode. Make sure that you always are signing up for this and reading it. And that's really it. Just make sure you come back for the next one, okay? Because I'm going to go through my actual ballot on the next one, and we're going to talk about individual ballot measures. Thank you.